Okay, so here is the thing about human origins. Most of us got a version of this story at some point, maybe in a museum with those little placard signs next to models of hunched over ancestors. A line of figures walking across a plain, each one a little taller and a little more upright than the last, toward the thing at the end of the line, which is us, modern humans, the finished product. And here is what I want you to hold in your mind. That image is wrong, not slightly off, not just incomplete. The one that actual researchers are piecing together right now from ancient bones and gene sequences and buried stone monuments. This is the story they have not quite gotten around to telling you, and tonight we are going to tell it. Let us start with the version most people know, the one that got packaged into textbooks and museum halls. Millions of years ago, our ancestors were ape-like creatures living in Africa. First came Australopithecus, the southern ape, walking on two legs across the African grasslands. Then came Homo habilis, the handyman, who figured out how to chip rocks into cutting tools. Then Homo erectus, the upright man, who discovered fire and walked all the way out of Africa into Asia and Europe. Paleoanthropologists call it the ladder model. One species leading to the next, each one a rung on the ladder. Scientists abandoned the ladder model decades ago. Not recently, not because of some new discovery that shocked everyone. Researchers now describe a bush, a sprawling, tangled, many-branched thing, with species appearing and disappearing and splitting off and sometimes coming back together in ways that would make the neat museum diagrams completely illegible. For most of the 20th century, the accepted date for the origin of Homo sapiens was around 200,000 years ago. And then in 2017, a bombshell. Researchers working at a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco announced results that ripped that timeline open. Fossils that had actually been sitting in a museum collection since 1961, originally mislabeled as Neanderthals, 315,000 years ago. That is not a minor revision. That is 100,000 years further back than the previous consensus, discovered from bones that had been sitting in a box for over 50 years before anyone looked closely enough to realize what they were. Here's a sentence that should have made international headlines, but mostly got buried in academic journals. In May 2023, a landmark study published in the journal Nature concluded that Homo sapiens did not descend from a single ancestral population in a single location. Modern humans appear to have emerged from at least two distinct ancestral groups that had been separated, living in different parts of Africa, evolving in partial isolation from each other, and then reconnecting through migration and interbreeding over hundreds of thousands of years. There was no single Garden of Eden, at least not in the genetic sense. There was no one tribe of proto-humans who had the breakthrough and went on to become us, while everyone else faded away. The researchers on that 2023 study used the image of a braided river, not a single stream, a braid, multiple channels that separate and rejoin, and sometimes separate again over a long distance before finally converging into a single flow, a braided river of populations flowing across the African continent over hundreds of thousands of years. Then in December 2025, the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted in Africa published its results, and things got even more interesting. Researchers from Uppsala University and the University of Johannesburg extracted ancient genomes from southern Africa, a part of the continent that had been largely excluded from the ancient DNA revolution. The populations of southern Africa, south of the Zambezi River, appear to have been genetically isolated from the rest of the continent for a very long time. Not a few thousand years, not even a few tens of thousands of years. Somewhere between 300,000 and possibly up to 1 million years of partial genetic isolation. 1 million years, 1 million years of living in the southern quarter of Africa, developing their own genetic profile, diverging slowly from populations to the north, and ultimately contributing their unique genetic heritage to the broader Homo sapiens story only when contact and mixing became possible in more recent times. 1 million years is a number that is genuinely hard to process. To put it in context, modern humans and Neanderthals are estimated to have diverged from a common ancestor somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 years ago. The genetic isolation of southern African populations may have been comparable in duration to the separation between our entire species and Neanderthals, and we only found this out in 2025. Now let us go somewhere genuinely strange, because within the human genome, in the DNA of living people alive today, scientists have found the fingerprints of populations that no one has ever found a fossil of. Not one bone, not one tooth, not one skull in a gravel pit, or a cave floor, or a museum drawer. These groups existed. They were real. They contributed DNA to the ancestors of modern humans, and they have vanished from the physical record so completely that without genetic analysis, we would have no idea they ever walked the earth. Researchers call them ghost populations. In 2020, a team led by geneticist Sriram Sankaraman at UCLA published an analysis of modern West African genomes. They found segments of DNA that could not be explained by any known human ancestry. Not Neanderthals, not Denisovans, something else. Something that had diverged from the lineage leading to modern humans somewhere between 360,000 and 1 million years ago. A deeply archaic group, older than any of the familiar players in the human family tree, that had survived long enough to encounter and interbreed with the ancestors of modern West Africans. We do not know what they looked like. We do not know if they walked fully upright or partly stooped. We do not know if they used tools, made fire, or cared for their dead. We have nothing but the mathematical echo of their existence, preserved in the living genome of their distant descendants. People walking around in West Africa today who carry a small fraction of an ancient genetic legacy from a population that has no name, no face, and no physical remains. That is not a fringe theory. That is not alternative history. That is a peer-reviewed finding published in a scientific journal and accepted by mainstream researchers. Ghost populations are real. Then in March 2025, researchers at Cambridge University published something that took the ghost population story even further. They found evidence that the single most significant genetic contribution from any archaic admixture event in all of human history was not the well-known Neanderthal interbreeding. It was an older event, approximately 300,000 years ago, an ancient mixing event between two deeply divergent populations of proto-Homo sapiens. The genetic contribution from that ancient mixing event is detectable in all modern humans alive today. Every single person on Earth, regardless of ancestry, at levels as high as 20%. 20%. 1/5 of the genome of every human being on the planet comes from an archaic admixture event that was discovered and published in 2025, and that most people have still never heard of. Let us talk about Neanderthals, because the story most people know about Neanderthals, brutish, dim, stooped, is not history. It is a caricature, a Victorian era projection that spent about a century masquerading as science. In 1911, a French scientist named Marcelin Boule published a detailed anatomical reconstruction of a Neanderthal skeleton. His reconstruction showed a stooped, bent-kneed, forward-leaning figure, clearly primitive, clearly not fully upright. This reconstruction was widely published, widely cited, and enormously influential. It shaped how scientists thought about Neanderthals for decades. It was based on a skeleton with severe arthritis and spinal deformation. The individual Boole worked from was an elderly Neanderthal who had been significantly disfigured by disease. So, what were Neanderthals actually like? Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes slightly larger by volume. They made jewelry from eagle talons and from shells collected far from where they lived, which means they had aesthetic sensibility and were willing to travel or trade for beauty. They used red ochre and black pigments, possibly for body decoration or ritual purposes. They made markings on cave walls that predate the arrival of modern humans in Europe by tens of thousands of years. They buried their dead, and Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of healed severe injuries, broken bones that required months of immobility to recover from. You cannot survive a broken pelvis 60,000 years ago without other people feeding you, protecting you, and looking after you for months. Neanderthals did that for each other. And then in 2010, the Neanderthal genome was published, and the truth was confirmed. Modern humans and Neanderthals had not just coexisted, they had interbred, repeatedly, extensively. If you are of non-African ancestry, roughly 1 to 2% of your DNA is Neanderthal. Some of that Neanderthal DNA is actually functional. Certain immune system variants, certain skin and hair characteristics, certain disease susceptibilities, all legacy code from our extinct cousins, still running in your cells right now. The Neanderthals did not just disappear, they merged. In 2010, scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany were analyzing genetic material extracted from a tiny bone fragment found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia. The bone was part of a finger, a pinky finger, small enough to fit in your palm, old enough to have been buried in that cave for somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 years. The genome from that bone fragment matched neither modern humans nor Neanderthals. It was something else entirely, a previously unknown branch of the human family, now called the Denisovans. The physical evidence for Denisovans remains almost absurdly thin. In total, researchers have recovered one finger bone, one tibial fragment, a handful of teeth, and a jawbone found in a Tibetan monastery. That is the complete physical fossil record for an entire human species. You could fit everything we have physically found of the Denisovans in a small box. Through the power of ancient DNA analysis, we know more about the Denisovans than we know about many species, represented by thousands of physical specimens. We know that they ranged across an enormous territory from the Altai Mountains of Siberia to Southeast Asia to the high Tibetan Plateau. We know that at least two genetically distinct populations of Denisovans existed. The populations from Melanesia and Australia trace their Denisovan ancestry to a different Denisovan group than the one that contributed DNA to East Asian populations. The Denisovans were not one thing. They were a family of related populations spread across half a continent, diverging from each other over thousands of years. Tibetan people, the communities that live and work and raise families on the Tibetan plateau at altitudes that would cause severe altitude sickness in most humans, carry a specific genetic variant called EPAS1 that allows their red blood cells to function efficiently in thin, high altitude air. This variant does not exist in most modern human populations. It came from the Denisovans, an ancient, unnamed, half forgotten branch of the human family that lived in a Siberian cave and left almost no physical trace of their existence. Somehow contributed the precise genetic tool that allows Tibetan children to run and play and breathe normally at 15,000 feet above sea level. That is one of the most remarkable examples of evolutionary inheritance in the history of life, a gift from the deep past, from people we only discovered existed 15 years ago, still functioning in living human bodies today. Within the Denisovan DNA, researchers found evidence of their own archaic admixture event. The Denisovans had apparently interbred with a fourth hominin group, one that diverged from the common ancestor of modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, more than 1 million years ago. The most likely candidate is Homo erectus, the first hominin to leave Africa, now dated to at least 1.9 million years ago. Homo erectus genes, filtered through the Denisovans, may be sitting in the genomes of people alive today. Every interbreeding event, every encounter between groups our ancestors could have walked away from but didn't, every moment of connection across what we now call species boundaries, all of it is preserved in the chemistry of our cells. We are a living record of a world that no longer exists. In September 2015, researchers at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa announced one of the most significant paleontological discoveries in recent memory. Deep inside a cave system called Rising Star, accessible only through a narrow underground passage that required researchers to remove their equipment and squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for a human body, they found a chamber filled with hominin bones, over 1,500 individual fragments, at least 15 individuals. They named the species Homo naledi, after the Sesotho word for star. Homo naledi was deeply strange. Its brain was tiny, around 500 cubic centimeters, barely larger than the brain of a chimpanzee. Its teeth were small and modern looking. Its feet were nearly identical to ours. Its hands and curved finger bones suggested an animal comfortable climbing trees. It was built from spare parts of different evolutionary periods, assembled into a body that looked like a puzzle with pieces from different boxes. The initial assumption was that such a primitive-looking creature must be ancient, 2 million years old, maybe 3 million. When the dating results came back, the scientific community had to sit down and reconsider. Homo naledi was not ancient. The bones in that chamber dated to between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago, contemporary with early Homo sapiens. A small-brained, primitive-bodied hominin was sharing the African continent with the ancestors of every human alive today. The world our early ancestors lived in was not an empty stage with only one human species taking up space. It was crowded, complicated, full of other people, people who looked different, who had evolved along different paths, who had different capabilities and different brains. Then in 2023, Lee Berger and his team went further. They published a paper claiming that Homo naledi had intentionally buried its dead in that underground chamber. They also reported finding what appeared to be engravings on the cave walls, possibly made by Homo naledi. If true, this would mean a species with a brain the size of an orange was engaging in ritual disposal of the dead and symbolic wall marking. The scientific community has not reached consensus on these claims. The debate is ongoing and sometimes heated. The boundaries we have drawn between cognitively modern and cognitively primitive, between symbolically capable and symbolically incapable, between fully human and not quite human, are being questioned at their foundations. Somewhere in southeastern Turkey, on a hilltop overlooking the broad plains of northern Mesopotamia, there is a site that has done more to challenge the conventional story of human civilization. It is called Göbekli Tepe. Beneath the surface of that hilltop, buried under centuries of accumulated soil, archaeologist Klaus Schmidt found enormous limestone pillars, T-shaped, some of them standing nearly 6 meters tall, weighing up to 20 tons, covered in detailed bas relief carvings of animals, foxes, wild boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, lions, and strange humanoid figures with no recognizable faces. These pillars were cut from limestone bedrock, shaped with stone tools, transported up the slope of a hill, and erected in precise circular arrangements, without metal implements, without the wheel, and without any draft animals. When was this built? Roughly 11,500 to 12,000 years ago. Let that number sit for a moment. That is 7,000 years before the pyramids of Giza, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, more than 5,000 years before the first cities appeared in Mesopotamia. By the conventional model of human cultural development, the people who built Göbekli Tepe should not have been capable of building Göbekli Tepe, because here is what the conventional model says. Civilization follows agriculture. First you get farming. Then, once you have surplus food and stable settlements, Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, people who did not farm, people who did not live in permanent settlements. Wandering bands of hunters and foragers built one of the most impressive ceremonial structures in the ancient world, completely inverts the conventional model, not adjusts it, not tweaks it, inverts it. And then there is the final detail about Göbekli Tepe, the one that nobody can quite explain. Around 10,000 years ago, approximately 1,500 years after it was built, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, not abandoned, not left to fall apart, deliberately, purposefully filled with debris and rubble and soil until the entire structure was covered. The people who used it sealed it away. Why? We don't know. There are no written records. There is no oral tradition that survives. There is only the act itself, enormous, deliberate, and completely mysterious. Here is a question that does not get asked enough. How much of human prehistory is currently sitting underwater? When the last ice age peaked, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels around the world were approximately 400 feet, about 120 meters, lower than they are today. Coastlines extended far beyond their current edges. Vast areas of continental shelf that are now submerged were dry land, fertile, habitable, riverine lowlands of exactly the kind that human beings prefer to settle. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. Much of Southeast Asia was a single landmass. The English Channel did not exist. Britain was connected to mainland Europe. And between Britain and what is now the Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark, there was a rich and productive landscape of forests, wetlands, river systems, and coastal plains. That landscape is now under the southern North Sea. It is called Doggerland, and before it drowned, It was almost certainly one of the most densely populated regions of Mesolithic Europe. We know Doggerland existed and was inhabited because the sea has been slowly returning its secrets to us for more than a century. Fishermen trawling the floor of the North Sea have dredged up ancient artifacts for generations: hand axes, harpoon points, the bones of land animals, worked antler and wood, objects that can only have come from a time when that seafloor was dry ground above water. Doggerland's end appears to have come suddenly, around 8,200 years ago. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, an event known as the Storga Slide, generated a catastrophic tsunami that swept across the remaining lowland areas of Doggerland, still above water. In geological terms, it was over in hours. The people living there were either killed outright or driven as refugees toward higher ground. Their homeland sank beneath the waves and stayed there. And Doggerland is just one example. Southeast Asia's Sundaland, the submerged coastlines of India, the drowned river valleys of the Persian Gulf, all of these were inhabited before the seas rose. All of them now sit under 60 to 100 meters of water, largely unexplored, carrying within them the material evidence of thousands of years of human presence. The picture of early human civilization that we have built from what is accessible above sea level is not complete. It may not even be representative. The parts of the ancient world most likely to have been densely populated are exactly the parts that are now underwater. Something happened approximately 12,800 years ago that deserves a lot more attention than it usually gets. The climate had been warming for thousands of years after the peak of the last ice age. Glaciers were retreating, sea levels were rising, and then, very suddenly, that all reversed. Within decades, possibly faster, temperatures in the North Atlantic region plunged by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. Glaciers that had been retreating stabilized, and in some places advanced again. The warming period came to a jarring halt. This cold snap lasted approximately 1,200 years. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas. The conventional explanation involves the catastrophic draining of a massive glacial lake, Lake Agassiz in North America, which at its largest was bigger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined, into the North Atlantic Ocean. A sudden flood of cold fresh water disrupted the ocean circulation system that acts as a heating mechanism for the North Atlantic. Temperatures plunged, ice advanced, the warming stopped. But in 2007, a group of researchers proposed something more dramatic and far more controversial: the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It suggests that a fragmented comet or asteroid struck or exploded over the northern hemisphere around 12,800 years ago. The explosion, they proposed, caused massive wildfires across North America, generating enough soot and debris to partially block sunlight and trigger the sudden cooling. It also suggests that this destruction contributed to the rapid extinction of more than 35 species of large mammals in the Americas: mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American horses, all gone in a geological instant. The scientific debate over this hypothesis has been extraordinary in its intensity. As recently as May 2024, a study published in a peer-reviewed journal reported finding a new layer of impact-related material in sediment cores from multiple sites across different continents. As of right now, in 2026, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is neither confirmed nor convincingly refuted. The debate continues. The Younger Dryas itself was a genuine massive climate disruption. It happened fast. It lasted over 1,000 years. It coincided with the extinction of a remarkable range of large animals and the disappearance of at least one known human culture in North America. Any human culture that existed in the regions most affected during this period would have been catastrophically disrupted. Communities that had spent generations developing specialized knowledge, traditions, and techniques would have found themselves suddenly facing a brutal cold snap with no time to adapt. We might be looking at an absence of evidence and misreading it as evidence of absence. In December 1912, at a meeting of the Geological Society of London, a man named Charles Dawson announced an extraordinary discovery. While digging in a gravel pit in Piltdown, East Sussex, England, he and his colleagues had recovered fragments of a skull and a jaw that appeared to represent the long sought missing link between apes and modern humans. The skull was large brained, clearly human like. The jaw was ape like, jutting and primitive. Together, they suggested a creature with a modern brain housed in an ancient ape like face. Exactly what many scientists in 1912 expected the earliest human ancestor to look like. The specimen was proclaimed one of the greatest discoveries in the history of science. The Natural History Museum in London celebrated it. Scientific papers were written about it. Textbooks included it. For 41 years, Piltdown Man was accepted as genuine by the mainstream scientific community. In 1953, researchers at Oxford University applied new dating techniques and discovered that the skull and the jaw were not from the same organism, not even close to the same age. The skull was human, dating to medieval times. The jaw was from an orangutan, probably only a few decades old when it was placed in the pit. The teeth had been manually filed down, then stained with chemicals to mimic the brown coloring of ancient bone. Someone had constructed an elaborate fake, planted it carefully, and let it be discovered. For 41 years, 41 years of the wrong story being told in classrooms and museums, 41 years of genuine fossils from Africa and Asia being dismissed or explained away because they did not fit the Piltdown narrative. Real evidence was subordinated to a fraud because the fraud was more convenient. Science eventually corrected itself. It always does, given enough time. But the 41 years of misdirection that preceded that correction are a warning. The story science tells about human origins is the best available story based on current evidence. It is also a story in progress. It has been wrong before, significantly, for long periods of time, in healthy skepticism, not cynical rejection, not conspiracy theory rejection, but genuine, rigorous, open minded skepticism is not just permitted, it is required. The ancient DNA revolution is one of the most remarkable things that has happened in science in the last 20 years, and it is moving so fast, the basic technology, extracting and reading genetic sequences from ancient bones, did not exist in its current form until the early 2010s. Now, researchers can extract full nuclear genomes from bones tens of thousands of years old, from specimens preserved in a wide range of climates, from sediment that contains no visible bones at all. We now know that modern humans carry genetic contributions from Neanderthals, Denisovans, and at least one unnamed ghost population, and that a massive archaic admixture event 300,000 years ago contributed around 20% to the genome of every living person. We know that Homo sapiens made multiple attempts to leave Africa before the successful migration approximately 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, with fossils of anatomically modern humans found in Israel dating to roughly 177,000 to 194,000 years ago. We know that the populations of southern Africa were genetically isolated for potentially hundreds of thousands of years, developing their own genetic profile distinct from populations in the north and east. And we know that within the Denisovan genome, the genetic signature of a fourth, unnamed archaic human group is detectable, one that diverged from the common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans more than 1 million years ago. Homo erectus genes, possibly filtering through Denisovans into modern humans, carrying the genetic legacy of the first humans to walk out of Africa across millions of years of extinction events and climate upheavals and world-changing catastrophes. Every person alive today is, genetically speaking, a walking archive. The full story of the last 2 million years of human evolution is encoded in you, most of it running silently in the background, shaping your immune system, your altitude tolerance, your susceptibility to certain diseases, with no visible marker to indicate its ancient origin. Your DNA knows things about your ancestors that you will never consciously know, and science is only just beginning to learn how to read it. You cannot tell the story of human origins without eventually confronting the question that may be the deepest mystery of all. Not when did we become anatomically modern, not when did we start making tools or burying our dead or building stone circles on hilltops. When did humans become the kind of creature that sits in the dark and tells stories, that asks where we came from, that builds meaning out of memory and imagination and words? Language is the thing that separates human culture from everything else we know of, not intelligence. Other animals are intelligent, not sociality. Many animals live in complex social groups, not even tool use. Multiple species make and use tools, is create and transmit an unlimited range of symbolic representations through a structured, recursive grammatical system. Language lets us talk about things that are not here, things that happened 100 years ago or will happen next Tuesday, things that do not exist at all except as possibilities, as fears, as dreams. The FOXP2 gene, which is essential for the fine motor control of the muscles involved in speech, is found in an identical form in Neanderthals and modern humans, meaning the genetic foundation for speech-related motor control was already present before our two lineages diverged, at least 500,000 years ago. A 2020 study tracking the evolutionary history of the neural pathway connecting auditory processing areas of the brain to speech production areas found that the origins of this pathway stretch back at least 25 million years, all the way to the common ancestors of both humans and monkeys. The infrastructure was ancient. What evolved in hominins over the last few million years was not the pathway itself, but the elaboration of it, the expansion and specialization that turned a basic auditory motor loop into the engine of human language. What seems increasingly clear is that the emergence of language was not a sudden event. It was a gradual assembly, piece by piece, capability by capability, over hundreds of thousands of years of a communication system that eventually crossed some threshold and became something qualitatively new. The precise location of that threshold is unknown, but once it was crossed, everything changed. Humans could pass knowledge to people they would never meet in times they would never see. Knowledge could accumulate across generations rather than being lost with each death. And one day, Much later, a species that had assembled this extraordinary capability sat down in a dark place and began to tell stories about where they came from. Let us be direct about something, because this is a question a lot of people are sitting with by this point in the video. If all of this is real, if the ghost populations, the multi-regional origins, the Denisovan complexity, the Göbekli Tepe puzzle, the Younger Dryas debate, and the Cambridge Ghost Genome paper, why do most people not know about them? The honest answer is not a conspiracy. It is messier than that. Academic publishing is a slow machine. A paper published in 2023 or 2025 does not automatically update every textbook in circulation. The lag between what the cutting edge of research knows and what the general public knows is enormous, measured not in weeks or months, but in years, and sometimes decades. Researchers who challenge fundamental assumptions face more skepticism, higher standards of proof, and more friction in the peer review and publishing process. The Anunnaki theory, the claim that Sumerian gods were extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered Homo sapiens to serve as slave labor, has no archaeological support. None. The Anunnaki were the high gods of the Sumerian religious tradition, important and fascinating figures in one of humanity's oldest literary and religious traditions, not alien DNA technicians. What is worth taking seriously, what demands serious engagement, is the genuine, documented, peer-reviewed scientific picture that has emerged from real researchers working with real evidence. The truth about human origins is stranger and more magnificent than the simple story, and stranger and more grounded than the fringe story. It sits in a place that requires you to hold complexity without resolving it too quickly in either direction. The work is not finished. It is nowhere near finished. The Jebel Irhoud skull that pushed our species' origin back to 315,000 years ago, that fossil had been in a collection since 1961. It sat there for over 50 years, labeled as a Neanderthal, until improved dating and comparative analysis revealed what it actually was. The Denisovan pinky bone had been stored in a lab drawer. The material that revealed the genetically isolated southern African population was extracted from bones using techniques that did not exist a decade ago. Ancient DNA from sediment, not even bones, just DNA molecules shed into cave dirt, is now allowing researchers to identify what species of hominins inhabited a site. These are not the dramatic Indiana Jones moments of paleontology. They are quiet, technical, laboratory-based discoveries, and the pace of discovery is accelerating, not slowing. The underwater landscapes of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, the submerged valleys of the Persian Gulf, have been surveyed only superficially. The cave systems of southern Africa, where Homo naledi was found, extend far beyond the chambers that have been investigated. Göbekli Tepe itself is only about 5% excavated. The vast majority of the site remains underground, sealed under the deliberate burial mound that preserved it for 11,000 years. The story of human origins is not a closed book that someone is keeping on a high shelf out of your reach. It is an open manuscript being written in real time by hundreds of researchers across dozens of countries, using tools and techniques that barely existed a generation ago. We are learning fast. We have changed our minds significantly in just the last decade, and we will almost certainly change our minds again. Let us sit with the full picture for a moment before we close. We are a species that emerged not from a single point of origin, but from a continent-wide confluence of populations. We carry in ourselves the genetic contributions of Neanderthals, Denisovans, ghost populations with no name, and ancient archaic humans who walked the earth more than 1 million years ago. We lived alongside other species of Homo naledi, possibly Homo floresiensis, on the Indonesian island of Flores, possibly others we have not yet found. We survived catastrophes that wiped out other large animals by the dozens. We built monuments 11,000 years ago that challenge everything we thought we knew about when organized. Complex, spiritually motivated human behavior began. The conventional story of human origins, the neat ladder, the single cradle, the inevitable march from ape to apex, was emotionally reassuring in a particular way. The real story tells us something different. We are survivors. We exist because of luck, resilience, adaptability. We are a collaboration between groups that our conventional categories would classify as different species, of climate shifts, of chance encounters, of migrations that happened to succeed when others failed, of interbreeding events that added just enough genetic diversity to make the difference in a crisis. The humans who survived, the lineages that made it, were the ones who were willing to encounter the other and recognize something of themselves in it. Every Denisovan tooth in a Siberian cave, every ghost population whisper in a West African genome, every Neanderthal cave painting predating our arrival in Europe. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they shared fire, sometimes they had children together. That is not a small thing. The question of where we came from does not have a final answer. It grows more layered and more fascinating every year. It is incomplete because the truth is almost impossibly rich, and we are still, generation by generation, digging it out of the earth. That is what researchers in caves and laboratories and genome sequencing centers around the world are doing right now. If the idea that the human story is still being written, that the next paper or the next excavation season might overturn something fundamental, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel is for. If this video opens something up for you, subscribe to Dreamtime Documents if you are not already, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the real, strange, magnificent story of human history. Good night.